Good to see you. Welcome again. Huh? I think I've given a copy of the syllabus to everybody who needs one this morning, but if not, Carol was gracious enough to make a few extra copies. So you have that. Sometimes it's just nice to have something like that to write on in the margins as well, take notes or whatever you want to do. So it's good to see all of you again. I remind you that these are being recorded, and Paul tells me that 2 or 3 days after the session, they should be up and posted. That's, I think, what happened last week. So if you aren't here, you can go back and see it online. Several people mentioned that they did that. And thanks to the crew, it sounds like the production quality is really quite good. So I appreciate that, and I think we should express our appreciation to those who make it happen. Second of all, just a reminder, we meet every Sunday in January, the first Sunday in February. We do not meet. It's the Bible Bowl. And then we gather again for the final session on the 9th of February. Two points by way of summary from last week. If I had to boil this down into 2 points, I would simply say we spent a fair bit of time thinking about the wider context of religious extremism globally and also across religious lines, and some of the features of that kind of broad notion of extremism, sometimes even violence, and how that plays itself out, not just in this country or just with American religious groups. The second thing is, and I remind everybody of this, that it's unfair to lump every evangelical or every this or every that into the same big pot and say, well, they're all extremists. I use the image of a kind of spectrum or continuum, and along that continuum, there's a kind of slide rule of extremists, extremism, and so on and so forth. And I think, I tried to make that point last time, but I think it's important to keep that going. Today, we're going to deal with Tim Alberta's sort of personal stake, his existential stake in all of this. Now, several of you have told me you have started to read this book, and you know what that's about, or you maybe even read the Atlantic Monthly article from last winter on this. And then from there, we're going to move to Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, and most of us in here are of an age when we can remember this. It seems now in the distant past, but if you live long enough, you know the distant past is still part of your reality, and we're going to spend a little time thinking about Tim Alberta's description of some of this and some of the implications. So I begin. In The Kingdom, the Power and the Glory, Tim Alberta asks a question that not only perplexes him, but many of us as well. I quote, "Polling showed that born-again Christian conservatives, once the president, that is, Donald Trump's softest backers were now his most unflinching advocates. Why? End quote. That's the question that works its way through this book and prompts him, under Jeff Goldberg's encouragement, to write this book. The answers to this question are at the heart, then, of this book, written by this practicing journalist and a practicing Christian conservative. As a believer in Jesus Christ, and as the son of an evangelical minister, Alberta has, by his own admission, struggled with this question. How could this kind of religious and political devotion be? Question mark. He couldn't just write off all the evangelical Christians that he knew summarily. Summarily as hypocrites. He knew this would not be fair or accurate. Rather, the evangelicals he knew were plotted, as I've said before, along a wide spectrum of views and motivations. Some, he says, were clear-eyed in understanding that supporting Donald Trump pragmatically did not require them to support him and his actions unconditionally. Whereas others willingly set to the side their Christian credibility and supported him unconditionally. But most evangelicals, he says, were somewhere in the middle. In a personal and very heartfelt turn, Tim Alberta makes clear to the reader that this question why is not simply an abstraction for him. It's not out there somewhere. He grew up in this conservative evangelical home where his father, formerly a finance person on Wall Street, atheist, unbeliever, had converted and become an evangelical Presbyterian pastor in a conservative suburb of Detroit. And that's where Tim grew up. His father's sudden death brings him back to his home church. Under very tragic circumstances, he is now confronted with many people in his home church. And it precipitated encounters with longtime friends and people he considered mentors from his youth, and who revealed their right-wing political leanings. Some even questioned Tim Alberta's faithfulness, sometimes even implying, because they had read his work, implying bluntly that he had gone astray. But often, very often, reassuring him that forgiveness was still possible. Needless to say, this was very difficult for Tim Alberta, especially in the midst of his own grief over his father's death, somebody he always felt close to and still felt close to. As he goes through this experience, he writes about his own father's turn to political conservatism, where his conservative brand of American patriotism had increasingly merged with his own brand of evangelical Christian conservatism. In effect, the American flag was being superimposed on the Christian cross, or vice versa. Being a faithful Christian meant being a conservative American patriot, which meant being a Trump supporter. There is a vivid imagery in his discussion of this. He'd go to worship services at this home church, and he went a fair bit because he was back and forth. Eventually they moved back to Michigan. And he said, when the active duty military people were on leave and came back to the church on a Sunday morning, they would get a rousing standing ovation. When the missionaries from wherever they were posted came back, they got the golf clap. You get the sense that this spoke volumes to Tim Alberta. The rationalizations for this may vary among the people in this congregation, but this was all the net effect. Christian conservatism meant patriotism, meant supporting a particular candidate. To deny any part of the scheme meant being unchristian, unpatriotic, or probably both. Dealing with this was a struggle, as I said, for Alberta, but out of it came his research and his reporting on what has happened in and to America, in and to American evangelicalism. And for those of you who have read or started to read the book, this is a complex story, and it's very often disheartening. Maybe even a frightening story in some cases, both for Christianity on the one hand and the United States of America on the other. To illustrate, this summer, I saw a bumper sticker. I won't tell you where I saw it, but I saw it. And on this bumper sticker, juxtaposed was the cross and the flag, and the caption read, "I will abandon neither one." The real message could not have been clearer. But what is evangelicalism? Here I'd like to just read a few words from Tim Alberta as he writes about this right up front. For those of us in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, parts of this will resonate, whereas other parts clearly will not. Alberta introduces this section with a really nasty note and letter he got from somebody in the congregation. And he showed it to his wife, who I think I may have alluded last time. She scanned it without expression. Then in a violent spasm, she flung the piece of paper into the air and with a shriek that made the church ladies jump out of their cardigans, cried out, "What the hell is wrong with these people?" In search of answers to that question, he writes, I took Dad's advice and pivoted away from political journalism. There would be no sequel to the earlier book that he had written, and so on. I knew there was another project that demanded my attention. Dad had implored me to apply my talents to subjects of more eternal significance, and I could think of nothing more eternally significant than the crack-up of the American evangelical church. This would not be an examination of Christianity writ large. Whatever the problems plaguing the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the Black Church, the rainbow flag-flying progressive church, and there are many, these are distinctive and diverging traditions. What I could offer was a window into my faith tradition. It happens to be the tradition that is the most polarizing and the least understood tradition, that is more politically relevant and domestically disruptive than any others combined: evangelicalism. Now that is a very pointed statement. To a certain extent, devotional overlap does exist. Some Catholics self-identify as evangelical, given the social connotations. Some non-white Christians count themselves as evangelicals due to the denominational background or theological disposition of the church. Research shows the Black Christians are far likelier to identify as born again than evangelical. A look at the broader Christian church would be incomplete without investigating and contextualizing these convergences. Yet a look at the broader Christian church would not yield a satisfying explanation of the turmoil within its commanding faction of conservative white Protestants. However imperfect the designation, for brevity's sake, these are the evangelicals whom I set out to chronicle following my father's death. Just a few more words from him. Even as evangelicals exploded, its definition remains somewhat ambiguous. In his book, Understanding Fundamentalism and Evangelicalism, historian George Marsden, who's been around a long time and written a lot, observed that in the decades following World War II, an evangelical was anyone who likes Billy Graham. Interestingly enough, I started at Concordia in 1985. Okay? Billy Graham was coming to town on a crusade. And my beloved colleagues set me up because the department had gotten an invitation from the local radio station to go on a talk radio call-in kind of thing and react from a Lutheran point of view to Billy Graham. And they thought that would be great for you, Jim. Well, I had strong feelings about that, theological feelings and so on and so forth. But, you know, the kind of rookie on the block couldn't say no, I suppose. So I went. Now, the interesting thing, nobody called in. Not one. Now, maybe it was just Midwest politeness. Maybe it was, who cares what this guy thinks? I don't agree with it. Who knows? So I ended up talking a lot, answering the interviewer's questions. So Billy Graham was around for quite a while. When Tim says, anybody who likes Billy Graham at that point was considered an evangelical. When Graham himself was asked to define the term, he responded, quote, actually, that's a question I'd like to ask somebody too. When he was asked the question, what is an evangelical? Billy Graham said, I'd like to know the answer to that too. In 1989, a British scholar named David Bebbington posited that evangelicals were distinct because of 4 principles. Biblicism, treating Scripture as the essential Word of God. Crucicentrism, stressing Jesus' death makes atonement for mankind possible. Conversionism, unbelieving sinners must be born again and continually transformed into Christ-likeness. And activism, sharing the gospel as an outward sign of inward transformation. The last comment, conversionism. We Lutherans in the ELC are probably not always inclined that way. In fact, I think we should be conversionist, and only when absolutely necessary should we use words. But that's what he says. Evangelicalism, however, as he says here, soon became synonymous with conservative Christian, and eventually with white conservative Republicans. Now, I can remember the day when Scandinavian Lutherans in this country were sort of slyly referred to as the Republican Party at prayer. I grew up in a staunchly Roosevelt, FDR, Democratic family, and be darned if I didn't marry into a Republican family. I mean, serious Republicans. One of Julie's uncles was the executive director in Washington, D.C. of the Republican Senators' Reelection Committee. That's serious. The other uncle, his brother, came within a whisker of being elected governor of Washington State as a Republican. Now, I'll tell you, there is nothing more ardent than a convert. She thinks I'm too wishy-washy in the middle, because I think republicanism, for all its faults, has been in the past a representative of a conservative set of voices in the political debate, and I think that's important. Okay. I note that Tim Alberta subtitles his book, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. I'll put my cards on the table and be blunt. I do not think this book is simply about the age of extremism in which evangelicals find themselves, but about evangelical extremism itself, which I would categorize, theologically speaking, as heretical. You only need to read the Gospel of Mark, read Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 5, and you don't even have to turn to the Old Testament. It's heretical if I understand anything about Christianity. I would also say that it is not in the most noble or the most humane traditions of American constitutional democracy. Okay. Let me pause here for a moment. That's how he introduces his book. Any questions, any comments, any observations? And I will try to repeat the question or comment. Kristen.
So I've been working on reading the book, and now that I'm looking at your syllabus, maybe you're going to spend all these weeks going through the different parts of it. But
Right.
and asking him, and I don't remember the exact question, but, what is he thinks when he thinks that the idolatry of America. That America is their idol. And that really resonated with me, that sort of explains a lot.
Yes, yes, yes. What I have left out in my remarks so far about this does turn on the associate pastor at Tim Alberta's church, who then becomes the lead pastor in that church, and is not inclined in the same direction as Alberta's dad. And the struggles he goes through and the transformation. He ultimately, I think, survives in that church for quite a while, but the church changes its theological complexion a fair bit. So you're exactly right about that. Now, just as a procedural matter, there's a whole lot in this book. I'm not going to be able to touch on it all in here. I have had to pick and choose certain chapters for the sake of time and maybe your attention as well. But if you read the book, there are a whole lot of things in between that I may only touch on.
Just thinking about people who might be listening and didn't hear Christy's comment, I think you should repeat that, because it is in a nutshell what she said.
She said, again, through this discussion of the associate pastor and his assuming the lead pastor's role, he realizes that this is basically idolatrous. This glorification of American patriotism is idolatrous and, in my vocabulary, heretical. Did I do okay? India?
The Republican Party has really changed, right, from earlier times. I don't recognize, when I was growing up in the 80s, and then when I was a young adult in the 90s, this is much different.
Yes. Anybody who writes about this addresses your question about the transformation or change in the Republican Party of yesteryear to today. Julie's uncle, who was the Washington, D.C. Republican Paul, would always tease me about being a communist because I wasn't a conservative Republican. It was all done in friendly good humor, and he and I got along really quite well. I was fond of him, and he was, I think, fond of me. And I remember we were living in St. Paul, and he came to visit us when he was in the midst of a campaign. I can't remember which one. And he had to excuse himself for a moment to go into our bedroom in our small apartment and return a telephone call. And he was probably in there 15 or 30 minutes. And he was raising his eyebrows. And I said, well, who were you speaking with? Oh, Barry Goldwater. And he was really frustrated with Barry Goldwater. It was over campaign issues. He probably was not frustrated over the conservatism, but that. His kids today, Julie's cousins, will have nothing to do with the Republican Party for precisely, India, the issue you raise. They say it would not recognize the party as it has become now. Okay, let's press on. From the sublime to the ridiculous here. Historically, perhaps, Alberta says, one of the best places to begin is to turn to Lynchburg, Virginia, with Baptist preacher Jerry Falwell. Many of us here remember those days in the 1970s and 80s when Jerry Falwell was just getting going at the Thomas Road Baptist Church and what eventually became Liberty University. But perhaps most of us, if you're like me anyway, have forgotten the implications of this for America. The implications for the United States and for the role of the church. Not only the role of the church, but just the United States and its relationship with the church, or the church's relationship with the United States, and how they came to be merged. Alberta takes us on a journey with an eye to the way this turned out, which isn't just ancient history. Jerry Falwell was born into a frontier family of bootleggers, alcoholics, atheists, as Alberta describes it. In 1952, 3 years after his father's death of cirrhosis of the liver, Jerry responded to an altar call and received Jesus as his Savior. In a time when revivals were common, the young evangelist Billy Graham was drawing huge crowds throughout the country. There is nothing unusual about the altar call approach, and Falwell switched vocational tracks and enrolled at Missouri Bible College and began training under the tutelage of a pair of fundamentalist and segregationist preachers. As Alberta describes him, Falwell was a people person, an extrovert, a schmoozer, indeed a born salesman. In 1956, he started his own church then, the Thomas Road Baptist Church, and soon began broadcasting sermons all over this relatively new medium of TV, which usually emphasized the so-called fundamentals of the faith: the virgin birth, the resurrection of Christ, the inerrancy of Scripture, and the substitutionary atonement of Christ's death. At this stage, according to Alberta, Falwell preached separatism. The followers of Christ are distinct and set apart. Their citizenship is in heaven, as Paul says in the letter to the Philippians. It echoes what I said last week about this enclave mentality. A few words from Alberta again. Falwell cited Jesus' own words as evidence. Quote, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Falwell said, reading this vintage translation from the New Testament, in other words, Falwell continued. He said, "Pay your taxes, forget politics, and serve me with all your heart." Alberta goes on to say, in truth, Falwell had never been apolitical. Back in 1958, just his second year of pastoring, Falwell denounced the Brown versus Board of Education court decision, which, as you remember, basically said that separate cannot be equal across racial lines. He says, saying the devil himself was pushing integration and that the true Negro did not want it. What will integration of the races do to us? He says. Falwell asked his all-white congregation, it will destroy our race eventually. As the years went on, Falwell was selective, but hardly silent with his partisan punditry. We would consider that blatant racism. We would consider that blatant racism. Now, in fairness to him, he did back off of some of those racist claims by denouncing them in pretty stark terms and trying to evangelize people of color into the Thomas Road Baptist Church. But you can see, it's there. It was also at this time that Falwell saw an opportunity for higher education. He started what in the beginning was the Lynchburg Baptist College, which later became Liberty Baptist College, and ultimately Liberty University. Well, in the early days, it was a struggle. It eventually turned into a billion-dollar enterprise with the motto, training champions for Christ. In 1976, the United States centennial year, largely to raise money, embarked on a 112 location I Love America tour. He thought the college needed a national appeal, and the patriotic message seemed like the best way to make that happen. He's a salesman. In the Great Awakening tradition, at least have been at least 2, maybe 3 in this country, in the 1970s, it seemed as though fundamentalism, and we talked a little bit about that last time, fundamentalism was making a resurgence, and mass communication was seen by Falwell and others as a way to make this happen. But the nature of fundamentalism was also changing. Fundamentalist preachers who had preached total separation from worldly affairs began now to turn toward the notion of a Christian civilization, and they thought the Christian civilization was collapsing and that the Christians needed to resist. Now, this message apparently appealed to many conservative older folks who also feared the total moral collapse of America, which was just around the corner. You might remember that in 1962, the Supreme Court case Engel v. Vitale banned prayer in the public schools, which is a bit of a misnomer. As I understand it, it didn't ban prayer per se, it banned public prayer. That issue hasn't gone away to this very day for some people in this country. Julie and I have a son-in-law who's superintendent of schools in Washington State. And there, he's having to deal with this to this very day. Groups who are challenging virtually everything that the public schools do. In the background, the lack of public prayer in the schools is an issue, but it often turns on sex education. Or opposition to it. This issue of prayer in the public schools inflamed issues having to do with curricular matters as well. Evolution, how about that one? The Scopes trial. Somewhere, I think it was in the New York Times in the last couple of weeks, I read an article about this. Human history, human sexuality, and the science of the cosmos. It all seemed like a conspiracy to pollute the minds of youngsters and to hasten the collapse of Christianity and Christian civilization. This gave rise to alternative schools and academies that were thought to protect children from the evils of the irreligious public schools. Falwell and others thought things needed to change in the face of these threats. I remember that the church in Washington, D.C., where I interned, the whole educational wing had been rented by one of these private Christian schools, elementary kids. In retrospect, I wish I had opened the window a little bit or the door to just see what was being taught. I was aware in that segregated community that the kids were all white. And the apartment that the church rented for Julie and me was on a street. And before we went there, Julie was just infatuated with this. It was Marlborough Pike. She loved the name of the road. That was going to be our address. We were thrilled. On our side of the street, everybody was white. On the other side of the street, everybody was black. Well, we had a few black people, but they were all on the maintenance staff on our side of the road. She taught in a school in the east side of Washington, D.C., in an all-black community. It was the heyday of busing. So the black kids were bussed out, the Korean kids and others were bussed in. It was a complicated world. Okay. A few more words from Alberta himself. For Falwell, however, there was change, but it wasn't happening fast enough. He had concluded, rightly based on research, that most fundamentalist Christians remained uninterested in politics. Many were not even registered to vote, and those who were showed no reliable appetite for engagement. Falwell hoped to bring his tribe along, but he couldn't ignore the potential that existed elsewhere. In 1976, the pollster George Gallup found that 1 in 3 Americans identified as born again Christians, and that an even larger share of the electorate agreed that the Bible should be interpreted literally. Falwell sensed that a fourth great awakening could be at hand, but only if he broadened his existing tent. If Christians were going to reclaim America, he was going to save his school, and he would need to cast a wider vision. Interestingly enough, and it's timely again, Jerry Falwell, as Alberta describes it, hated Jimmy Carter with a passion. Hated him with a passion. And there was one reason in particular. Bob Jones University was going to be disqualified from dispensing public funds to students because of Bob Jones's racist policies. And Jerry Falwell and others were convinced this was just one more step in the process of collapsing Christian civilization. Okay. As I said, he hated Jimmy Carter. When I wrote this, Jimmy Carter was 100 years old. This past week, as many of you, I sat down where I get much of my information, Oregon Public Radio, and listened to the eulogies. A remarkable man, and a more remarkable president than he's probably been given credit for. Christians needed to resist because America was floundering and on the brink of death. Apocalyptic language was the order of the day. Falwell and many kindred spirits, James Dobson, for example, Beverly LaHaye, Don Wildman, gathered together and considered their dilemma and turned to Jerry Falwell to lead what became known as the moral majority. As Alberta says, they had a catchy name, but they had no rationale. That's where they turned next. And in 1973, of course, the Supreme Court handed down Roe v. Wade. It was the abortion decision, and the evangelical race was on. A conflict that would last now for 50 plus years, and indeed to this very day, as we know. While the evangelicals were not uniformly anti-abortion in the day, the movement to gin up anti-abortion support folded abortion into the same secular hedonistic basket as so many other issues that were thought to signal the collapse of Christian morality. And who knew best than the so-called moral majority? That story has played itself out right up to this present day. I remember just before that decision, the recent decision came down, reading Ruth Bader Ginsburg's view of Roe v. Wade. And you may hear that she was opposed to it. Short answer, yes, but why? She wasn't opposed to the substance of it. She was opposed because she thought it was overreach and it would elicit a reaction, a negative reaction. And she thought the country would get where it should be just being patient, because that was the basic movement. Now you've got the moral majority, Christian evangelicals, seeing it as evidence, further evidence of the collapse of Christian civilization, and they sidled up alongside the Roman Catholics with a different sort of theology and ecclesiology. And if you've ever been in a debate with ardent anti-abortion people, you know that they're wanting to move in the direction of fetal personhood. And the consequence of this, we all know. It does not stop abortion. What it does do is put women's health at serious risk. Okay, the monetary benefits to Falwell, his church, and his college were enormous. But so was the political power and influence. His political power and influence. He bought his own plane, of course, that's not unusual in these cases. He made the rounds of the national shows. He was on Larry King Live, for example. He was plastered on the cover of Time magazine. And the separatist instinct of the early Falwell was completely over. And some in his orbit, he was so far over for Jerry Falwell that some in his orbit felt like he had gone way overboard and beyond the bounds, and they were tired of the resulting circus that sort of developed around the moral majority and their increasingly fanatical views. To some, the God and country stuff got old and spiritually problematic. But the lure of power and money seemed irresistible. Now, in May of 2007, Jerry Falwell Sr. died of a heart attack in his office at 73 years of age. Now, that's not that long ago. After disbanding the moral majority in 1989, realizing that he himself had lost sight of his pastoral responsibilities, his national influence had dwindled only to be replaced by a new generation of culture warriors. He had started the God Save America campaign in 1996 and launched a new radio program called Listen America a couple of years later. But his glory days were largely over. By the turn of the century, he was much more of a punchline than a provocateur, largely reduced to mismanaging Liberty University and calling people names. You may remember this one, referring to Ellen DeGeneres as Ellen Degenerate. So the name-calling business is not exactly new, if we needed to be reminded. In 1988, Liberty University almost had gone under financially. His once formidable empire was in serious debt, and he could not repay it. During these years, perhaps mostly out of duty to his father, Jerry Jr. stepped up, in effect, he set out to run the university. He was a graduate of University of Virginia Law School, and Jerry Jr. hoped he would have a career in real estate. He took the reins over the university, although he had never, as a younger person, shown much interest in the university. And he wasn't really inclined toward fundamentalism either. As a youth, he bristled and he chafed under the expectations of his father. Despite disavowing, Jerry Jr. despite disavowing being a moral example, he was a good businessman, and he knew prior to his father's death that if his father's empire were to survive, it would need to be pared back and put on a sound financial footing. After several years of financial austerity, the ship was righted, and after his father's death, he became the president of the university, while his brother Jonathan took over pastoral duties at Thomas Road Baptist Church. This is a family affair. It's the family business. The story of Jerry Jr.'s rise and eventually his demise turns, in some sense, according to Alberta, in 2016 with the emerging relationship between Jerry Jr. and Donald Trump. Long story short, Jerry Jr. became increasingly autocratic as president, refusing to brook any real dissent. As Alberta says, he seemed intent on testing the limits of his invincibility. In 2016, after Trump had secured the Republican nomination, Falwell Jr. traveled to New York for a meeting of influential evangelical leaders where he made clear he was no mere supporter of Trump, but a pitchman. He, along with Franklin Graham, there's a beauty, the son of Billy Graham, vouched for Donald Trump's character and integrity. Falwell was ecstatic, recalling his father's alliance with Reagan and the way that had shaped the political landscape of America. On campus, he cracked down on serious criticism, especially criticism of Trump. After he had become president, he was an autocrat. And after the tragic Charlottesville debacle, he doubled down on his authoritarian instincts, refusing to allow the student newspaper at Liberty University to publish a critical article of Trump's response. Outwardly, however, the university appeared to be flourishing. Money flowed, building continued. Whatever problems there were and flaws there were, bubbled below the surface. And they were masked by his reputation as a developer and a fundraiser. It's probably not the first time that story has been written, but things would soon come crashing down on him and the university. He published a picture of himself on a donor's yacht with his arm around a pregnant young woman's midriff. University officials, seeing no alternative, placed him on temporary leave. A short time into his leave, he and his wife, Becky, issued what Alberta describes as a bizarre statement to a blogger at the Washington Examiner, saying that she had been carrying on an affair with a family friend. Not only damning by itself, this was intended as damage control for the Reuters article that would come out the next day, describing a three-way sexual affair with a pool boy in Miami. Watch out for the pool boys. The university painted Falwell as a rogue and forced him out as president. What followed at Liberty, however, was to reveal the rot that had set in at the institution and how deep it actually ran. Falwell's departure revealed only the tip of the iceberg. Various people came forward with allegations, and efforts to right the moral ship continue to this day. Who knows where it goes? In this tortured Falwell story, we see many things. Most conspicuously, perhaps, is what happens when religious communities and institutions move from separatism to kingdom building. Move from an enclave mentality to God save the world with us as God's agents mentality. When they move from basic, and in this case Christian, humility to arrogant assertions of theological certainty and moral rectitude. It also shows how religious communities centered on a single individual can easily become cult-like and in the process inherently unstable as the leader exhibits their feet of clay. And they crash in disgrace. Pride and arrogance come before the fall. I think we've heard that a couple times before. And cult leaders have shown over and over again what happens when they shut themselves off from critique, serious self-reflection, and empathy for alternative ways of thinking and behaving, and when they sacrifice their integrity for power and what they put themselves above human compassion. Throughout this discussion, we can see, I think, the importance of distinguishing properly the relationship between the religious worlds and socio-political worlds. When that doesn't happen, trouble sometimes, very serious trouble, most of the time awaits us. I am yours, Larry.
There's another person I'd like to mention within this movement is Rush Limbaugh.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Right. Larry mentions the name Rush Limbaugh, who had an enormous audience, and I don't know. He was probably a favorite of the evangelicals. I don't know that he had any religious commitments. He was just an opportunist in many ways, I think. Yeah, but Rush Limbaugh. In other words, certain kinds of media. We could probably add others to that thing. Exactly right. I think it is interesting to see how some of the issues that are going on right now with regard to the collapse of civilization or the idea that this replacement theory, all of us white people are just going to be replaced. Some of those ideas and flickers are there long before. Now, some of you may have read, what's his name, Stevens. He was a Republican Paul, kind of contemporary of Julie's uncle. He wrote the book in the last few years entitled, "It Was All a Lie." And he takes chapter by chapter and talks about the implicit and explicit racism in the Republican Party, misogyny, and right on down the line. It was all a lie. And here we are, folks. So next week, our time is up. Next week, I want us to turn to Roman numeral 4, Greg Locke and the Global Vision Church, the kingdom builders. There are other kinds of kingdom builders that have come along and are out here. Okay? If there are no, Pastor Allison.
Hello, I just wanted to remind folks that we are gathering downstairs now for lunch for those who would like to meet our neighbors and find out if they have shared interest in climate issues. So please join us for lunch downstairs in the Children's Commons, and we will go in pairs, and you'll be trained first, and then we'll go meet our neighbors. So thank you.
Thanks for coming, folks.